The dig site was already burning when Verk Solin dropped through the dust cloud and hit the ground running. 3 charges had detonated inside the excavation trench within the last 90 seconds. The first had shattered the sealed containment vault where his team stored recovered artifacts. The second had punched a crater into the northwest wall, exposing a cross-section of sediment layers his team had spent 2 years cataloging. The third had killed someone. He did not know who yet. Verk pressed himself flat against the inner wall of the main trench and checked his scanner. The device was rattling with so many overlapping signals that the display had gone white. He struck it once against his palm, and it settled enough to show him heat signatures. 14 of his own people scattered through the dig complex, 1 motionless. 1 dead then, 1 of his 14. He did not let himself think about which name that motionless signature belonged to. Not yet. Solin. The voice came through his helmet comm, crackling with interference. Solin, this is Rithane. We are pinned in the artifact bay. They came through the eastern access. Armed, organized, not ours. Verk moved along the trench wall, staying low. His body was not built for combat. He was Kyrthani, broad-shouldered but thin-limbed, his joints articulated for delicate excavation work, not running or fighting. His hands, with their 6 triple-jointed fingers, could brush dust from a 60,000-year-old ceramic shard without cracking it. They could not hold a weapon steady under fire. He was an archaeologist, the most decorated field archaeologist the Kyrthani scholarly dominion had produced in 3 centuries, and he was 60,000 years too late to understand what he had found on this planet. Rithane, who are they? He said into the comm. A pause, then, locals. The word hit him like the charges had hit his trench. Locals. This world, this dead, abandoned, radiation-scarred rock that the Dominion had classified as uninhabited 60,000 years ago when the Kyrthani departed had locals. The planet was called Earth in the old records. A minor way station on the Dominion's colonial expansion route, surveyed and catalogued, and then discarded when the biosphere proved too volatile and the dominant species too primitive to warrant further investment. The Kyrthani had maintained a small archaeological observatory here for 2 centuries, studying the indigenous culture the way one might study interesting insects. Then they left, packed up, filed the reports, sealed the observatory, and departed for worlds that mattered more. 60,000 years ago. Verk had come back because the Dominion's archive flagged this world for a routine heritage reclamation audit. Every 10 millennia or so, the auditors checked whether abandoned sites still held recoverable material. Most of the time, the answer was erosion, tectonic drift, and silence. Verk had expected to find dust and fossils. He had volunteered for this assignment because it was quiet, remote, and gave him time to work on a monograph about Kyrthani colonial-era ceramics that he had been drafting for 8 years. Instead, his orbital scans on approach had shown something that made his navigator recalibrate the instruments 3 times. Cities. Vast, luminous cities spread across continents that the old map said should be barren. Atmospheric readings that indicated advanced industrial output. And in orbit, something his ship's classification system could not categorize structures so large that the computer kept tagging them as natural formations because no engineered object should be that size. He had landed anyway, because he was an archaeologist, and the only thing more powerful than his survival instinct was his need to understand. Now he was crouched in a burning trench. While people he had never met fired weapons, his scanners could not identify at a dig site that should not have existed in the first place. Rithane, how many? 4, maybe 5. Light armor. They are not trying to kill us, Solin. They are trying to contain us. There is a difference. Verk processed that. Containment, not extermination. That meant the locals, the humans, his records called them, the species the Dominion had dismissed as pre-agricultural primitives 60,000 years ago, wanted his team alive. He found that more frightening than the alternative. He moved through the trench system, keeping low, his thin legs carrying him over rubble with the careful precision of someone used to navigating fragile excavation sites. The dust cloud from the charges was thinning, and through the haze he could see the artifact bay, a prefab structure his team had erected over the most significant find of the excavation. The find that had changed everything. 3 weeks ago, his team had unearthed a sealed chamber beneath what they initially believed was the remains of the old Kyrthani observatory. Standard procedure: cut through the seal, document the contents, crate the artifacts for transport home. But the chamber was not Kyrthani. The architecture was wrong. The materials were wrong. The scale was impossibly, overwhelmingly wrong. The chamber stretched for 2 kilometers underground, and it was full of Kyrthani artifacts, cultural objects, scientific instruments, artistic works, personal effects, all of it perfectly preserved in environmental conditions that no primitive species should have been able to maintain. 60,000 years of Kyrthani heritage, collected and curated and stored with a care that made Verk's own museum look crude by comparison. The humans had kept it, all of it. Everything the Kyrthani had left behind, everything they had discarded as worthless, everything they had abandoned when they walked away from this world 60,000 years ago, the humans had gathered it and preserved it with a meticulousness that bordered on devotion. And now the humans were here, and they were not happy about the digging. Verk reached the artifact bay and pressed himself against the outer wall. Through a crack in the prefab paneling, he could see Rithane, his site manager, a stocky Kyrthani woman with burned scars on her hands from a chemical spill 3 years ago, crouched behind an overturned crate with 2 junior researchers. Their faces were blank with controlled terror. Behind them, pressed against the far wall, Pelling lay motionless. Verk's stomach dropped. Pelling, his youngest researcher. 23 years old, brilliant at sediment analysis, terrible at cards. Beyond Rithane, at the bay's eastern entrance, stood 2 figures. They were tall, taller than any Kyrthani by nearly a head. Their armor was matte gray, close-fitting, with no visible joints or seams. It moved with them like a second skin. No helmets. Their faces were exposed, and Verk spent a long moment studying those faces because studying was what he did. Hard features, sun-weathered skin, eyes that tracked the room with a calm, systematic attention that Verk recognized because he used the same attention when surveying a new dig site. These were people who cataloged their environment before they acted in it. One of them, a woman with close-cropped dark hair and a thin scar running from her left temple to her jaw, was speaking into a device on her wrist. Her voice was low, unhurried. The language was not one Verk's translator could parse in full, but he caught fragments. Enough to understand that she was reporting to someone, and that her report included the phrase, "They found the vault." The vault, the 2-kilometer preservation chamber, the 60,000-year archive of Kyrthani heritage that the humans had built and maintained beneath the dust of a world the Kyrthani had considered beneath notice. Verk made a decision. It was not a brave decision or a calculated one. It was the decision of a man who had spent his entire life studying the remnants of cultures that could no longer speak for themselves, and who now stood in front of a culture that very much could. He stepped into the bay with his hands raised, all 6 fingers spread wide in the Kyrthani gesture of unarmed intent. "My name is Verk Solen," he said. "I am an archaeologist. I did not come here to fight." The 2 humans turned to look at him. The woman with the scar tilted her head slightly, the way one might study an unexpected insect on the windowsill. Not hostile, not afraid, mildly curious. A patience in that expression that felt older than it should have. "We know," she said, and her translator rendered it in clean, accented Kyrthani. "That is why you are still breathing." Her name was Commander Odessa Wren, and she was the senior cultural protection officer for what she called the Northern Rampart Sector. Verk would learn later that the Rampart sectors were administrative zones within a planetary defense network, so vast, and so deeply integrated into Earth's infrastructure that the planet itself functioned as a single strategic installation. But in that first hour, crouched in the dust of his own dig site while Wren's team methodically secured the area and a medic examined Pelling dead, confirmed, from a structural collapse triggered by the excavation charges. Not from human weapons, all he learned was that Commander Wren was patient, precise, and profoundly angry about the hole his team had cut through the vault's outer seal. That seal was designed to last another 40,000 years, she told him, her voice flat and controlled. They were sitting on camp stools outside the artifact bay, the dust settling around them, the sky above filled with things Verk was trying not to look at. Your team compromised it in an afternoon. We did not know what was inside, Verk said. It sounded inadequate even as he said it. No, Wren agreed, you didn't. She let the silence do its work for a moment. Then she stood and gestured for him to follow. She led him out of the trench complex and onto the surface, and that was when the scale of his miscalculation began to register in full. The dig site sat in a high desert basin, ringed by low sandstone ridges. When Verk had landed 3 weeks ago, those ridges had been empty, dry stone and scrub vegetation under a pale sky. Now the ridges were lined with structures. Defense emplacements, Verk's trained eye told him, though they were like no military architecture he had encountered. They were smooth, organic-looking, integrated into the rock as though they had grown from it. Gun positions, sensor arrays, communication towers, all of it had appeared in the 3 weeks since his arrival, and all of it was pointed at his ship. Beyond the ridges, the sky had changed. 2 weeks ago, the sky had been empty except for clouds, and the occasional atmospheric vehicles small craft Verk had assumed were scientific survey drones. Now it was full. Warships, human warships, hung in the upper atmosphere like suspended mountains. Verk counted 7 before he stopped counting, because the largest of them extended beyond the curve of the horizon, and he could not see where it ended. Its hull was dark against the pale desert sky, and the sunlight caught surfaces along its flank that Verk's archaeologist brain automatically categorized as weapons platforms, shield generators, launch bays. The ship was not merely large. It was infrastructure. It was a mobile defense installation the size of a small moon, and it was parked directly above his dig site with the casual authority of something that had always been there and always would. How long have those been in position? He asked Wren, keeping his voice as steady as he could. Since your ship entered the system, she said, 17 days ago. 17 days. His ship had been in this system for 17 days, and in that time the humans had assembled a defense fleet that could sterilize a continent, built a ring of ground installations around his dig site, and deployed a cultural protection officer with a 4-person security team to manage the situation. And they had done all of it without his sensors detecting a single anomaly until they chose to be seen. Verk was an archaeologist. He studied dead civilizations. He understood power through its remnants. The size of the foundations told you about the buildings. The depth of the fortifications told you about the wars. The care of the burial sites told you about the values. He was very, very good at reading power from its artifacts. What the artifacts of this civilization told him was that he was standing inside the mouth of something so large that the mouth itself was invisible, and the mouth had teeth. Commander Wren, he said carefully, my people left this world 60,000 years ago. We classified the dominant species as pre-agricultural. We recorded no significant technological capability. We left nothing behind that should have enabled any of this. He stopped because Wren's expression had shifted. It was not anger. It was something worse. It was pity. You left, she said. That is accurate. You left everything behind. We took what had value to us. You took what had value to you, and you left behind everything else. Your cultural archives, your astronomical data, your medical research, your art, your music. 300 years of presence on this world, and when you decided it was not worth your time, you packed your ships and walked away from all of it. Every instrument, every recording, every personal belonging that someone decided was not worth the cargo space. Standard procedure for colonial withdrawal. The material was cataloged for potential future. Retrieval, yes, the retrieval notice was in your files. It said someone might come back in 10,000 years. Ren looked at him with those steady, cataloging eyes. We found those files, we found everything, and we decided to keep it. Verk's throat tightened. Why? The question came out before he could stop it, and it was the only question that mattered. Why would a primitive species, a species so young it had barely mastered stone tools when the Kairthani arrived, spend 60,000 years preserving the abandoned heritage of a civilization that had studied them like insects, and then left without a word of farewell? Ren did not answer immediately. She turned and looked out across the desert basin, at the dig site below them and the ridges around it and the impossible sky above. When she spoke, her voice had lost its military edge and taken on something older, more personal. Because it was beautiful, she said. Because your people stood on this ground and painted the night sky with pigments we had never seen. Because your astronomers mapped stars we had not yet named and left the charts behind like they were scrap paper. Because your medical researchers cataloged 100 diseases and left the cures behind in a storage cabinet that nobody bothered to lock. And when the plagues came 12,000 years later, those cures saved millions of us. Because your musicians composed frequencies that made our oceans resonate in ways we spent centuries trying to understand. Because every piece of what you threw away taught us something about what it meant to reach for the universe and hold it. She turned to face him, and in the bright desert light, the scar on her face looked like an old river channel cut into stone, weathered, deep and permanent. Your people studied us like animals, archaeologists. You looked at us and saw nothing, but we looked at what you left behind and saw everything you were. And we decided it was worth saving. Verk did not speak. He could not speak. His translator was working, feeding him her words in clean Kairthani syntax, and every word landed in the exact center of a wound he had not known he carried. He was an archaeologist. He had spent his career handling the artifacts of lost civilizations with reverence and care, reconstructing their stories from fragments, arguing in academic conferences that every culture deserved preservation regardless of its technological level. And now he was standing on a world where a species he had been taught to dismiss had spent 60 millennia doing exactly that, preserving a culture that had not cared enough to say goodbye. Ren brought him to the vault the next morning. Not through the hole his team had cut. Through the front entrance. A massive stone gateway set into the desert floor, 3 kilometers from the dig site, invisible from the surface because it was covered by a thin layer of desert hardpan that had been deliberately maintained to look undisturbed. The humans had hidden their own front door beneath 60 millennia of carefully managed anonymity. The gateway opened at Ren's biometric command, stone panels sliding apart with a precision that spoke of engineering tolerances measured in microns. Inside, the temperature shifted, the air changed, the light changed, and the scale made Verk's legs buckle. He had seen the vault through the breach his team had made a partial view, dusk clouded, lit by emergency lamps. That had been like glimpsing a cathedral through a keyhole. The real vault was something else entirely. It stretched below them in tiers, descending into the earth like a vast amphitheater, each level wider than the last. The lighting was warm and steady calibrated. Verk realized with a jolt that nearly stopped his hearts, to the exact spectrum of Kairthani daylight. Not Earth daylight, his daylight. The golden amber frequency of the star his homeworld orbited, reproduced with a fidelity that made his eyes sting. The air was climate-controlled to match the atmospheric conditions of the Kairthani homeworld, a world these humans had never visited. The humidity, the pressure, the trace mineral content in the ventilation. all of it tuned to preserve Kayarthani biological materials at optimal conditions. Based on data the humans could only have reverse-engineered from the abandoned samples and equipment the Kayarthani had left behind. They had recreated his world. Underground, on an alien planet, 60,000 years after the original occupants had walked away, the humans had built a pocket of the Kayarthani homeworld and filled it with everything his people had discarded. And the environmental readings were within 1.6% of the actual homeworld parameters. Ren walked him through the tiers in silence, letting him look. The artifacts were arranged not by type or age, not the way a Kayarthani museum would organize them, but by context. Each section recreated the environment where the objects had originally been used. A research station, faithfully reconstructed from the abandoned observatory, with instruments still in their original positions and calibration notes pinned to the walls in Kayarthani script. A residential quarter, with personal effects displayed in the rooms where they had been found cookware, clothing, a child's toy that someone had left on a shelf and never reclaimed. An astronomical observation deck, with star charts mounted on the walls and a telescope, a Kayarthani telescope, 60,000 years old, its optics maintained to operational condition, still pointed at the sky through a shaft that rose to the surface. Verk paused at each section, his professional instincts warring with his emotional ones. The preservation was extraordinary. Artifacts that should have degraded to dust over 60 millennia were in condition that any Dominion museum would envy. The environmental controls alone represented an engineering investment that staggered him, maintaining homeworld specification atmospheric conditions for 60,000 years required not just technology but commitment. Someone had to maintain those systems. Someone had to care enough, century after century, millennium after millennium, to keep the lights on and the air clean and the temperature steady in a vault full of someone else's discarded heritage. On the third tier, he found the music. An entire section dedicated to Kayarthani compositional recordings. The originals were their crystalline data cores that his people used for audio storage, each one sealed in a protective housing that the humans had designed and manufactured specifically for this purpose. But beside each original was something else, a human translation. Spectral analyses, frequency breakdowns, harmonic maps, decades of work by human musicologists trying to understand a form of expression created by a species with a fundamentally different auditory system. And in a small alcove at the section center, a set of instruments, not Kayarthani instruments, human instruments, hand-built, designed to reproduce Kayarthani tonal frequencies within the range of human hearing. Someone had spent their career building tools to play music that was never meant for human ears, because the music was there, and it deserved to be heard. Verk picked up one of the instruments. It was crude by Kayarthani standards, a stringed device with resonating chambers tuned to approximate the subharmonic range that his species used for emotional expression. But it was lovingly made. The wood was polished smooth with use. The strings had been replaced many times. This instrument had been played regularly by someone who cared about what it could produce. He set it down carefully. His hands were trembling. At the lowest tier, Verk stopped. A wall of names, Kayarthani names, inscribed in Kayarthani script, covering the entire curved surface of the vault's deepest level. Hundreds of names. He recognized the formatting. They were personnel records, every Kayarthani who had served on this world during the 3 centuries of occupation, from the first survey team to the last evacuation transport. And beside each name in smaller text, a human annotation, what that person had done during their time on Earth, their role, their research, their contributions, fragments of personal journals that the humans had translated and cross-referenced over millennia. They had not just recorded the names, they had reconstructed the people. "You did this for strangers," Verk said. His voice was very quiet now. "We did this for neighbors," Ren corrected. "You lived on our world. You breathed our air and walked on our ground and watched our sky. That makes you neighbors. And we do not forget our neighbors. Even neighbors who left without saying goodbye. Especially those. She was quiet for a moment. Archaeologist, you must understand something. We did not do this because we admired you. We did not do this because we hoped to gain something from it. We did it because it was the right thing to do. Because cultures that abandon their heritage do not deserve to lose it, they deserve someone who will hold it for them until they are ready to come back. Verk pressed his hand against the wall. His 6 fingers spread across names he did not know, people who had lived and worked and breathed on this world before his species had decided it was not worth the effort. One name caught his eye. Custodian Solen, his own family name. A minor technician who had served on the last survey team before the withdrawal, a gray-tan, many times removed, whose name appeared in Verk's own genealogical archives as a footnote, a person who had existed, and then vanished into the vast anonymity of colonial service records. Her name was here, on a wall on a planet, in a vault built by a species that had never met her, preserved for 60,000 years because the humans believed she mattered. The first sob surprised him, the second did not. He wept in the lowest tier of a vault built by a species his civilization had dismissed as primitive, surrounded by the carefully preserved remnants of his own people's indifference. And Commander Odessa Wren of the Northern Rampart Sector stood beside him and did not look away. She did not offer comfort. She did not speak. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back and her face composed, and she waited, the way a person waits who has waited 60,000 years and can wait a little longer. The crisis was not over. It was, in fact, only beginning. Verk's ship had filed a distress signal before he could countermand it. Standard protocol. When a Kyrthani archaeological team encountered armed resistance, the ship's AI automatically transmitted a priority alert to the nearest Dominion military relay. That relay, in this case, was a patrol station 12 light-years away, crewed by a Kyrthani naval detachment that had never heard of Earth and did not know what was waiting for them. The signal reached them 8 hours after the incident at the dig site. They dispatched a response force within the hour. 3 cruisers, a support vessel, and a diplomatic corvette carrying a regional adjudicator named Torsh Vaughn, who had the authority to make binding decisions on behalf of the scholarly Dominion and the temperament of a man who had never been told no. Verk learned about the incoming force from Wren, who informed him with the same calm precision she used for everything. "Your military is 12 hours out," she said. They were sitting in the dig site's command tent, or what remained of it, eating a meal that Wren's team had prepared from human rations. The food was strange. A grain porridge with some kind of dried fruit and a sharp herb Verk could not identify. Not unpleasant. Verk was too exhausted and too emotionally scraped to care about its composition. "They will demand the return of our artifacts," he said. "Yes. And you will refuse." "We will offer, there is a difference. We will offer to return everything. We will not be ordered to." "Commander, Adjudicator Vaughn is not a diplomat. He is an enforcer. He will interpret your refusal to submit to his authority as an act of territorial aggression and respond accordingly." Wren ate without hurrying. She chewed, swallowed, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Verk noticed that the gesture was identical to one his grandmother had used, a small, meaningless parallel that lodged in his chest like a splinter. "Archaeologist," she said, "your 3 cruisers will drop out of transit in approximately 11 hours. At that point, they will be greeted by the 7th and 9th Rampart fleets, which comprise 64 warships, 12 orbital defense platforms, and the deep space monitoring array that has been tracking their approach since the moment they engaged their transit drives." She took another bite, chewed, swallowed. "If your adjudicator Vaughn chooses aggression, the engagement will last approximately 90 seconds. We would prefer that it lasts 0 seconds. You want me to stop him?" I want you to help him understand what he is walking into. Because I would rather not kill anyone today, archaeologist. We have spent 60,000 years preserving your heritage. I would prefer not to add a battle to the record. Verk looked at her across the camp table, and for the first time since landing on this world, he felt something other than awe or terror. He felt kinship. Not the kinship of shared biology or shared history, but the kinship of shared purpose, the recognition that the person across from you wants the same outcome you do, even if their reasons and their means are entirely different. "What do you need me to do?" he said. Ren pulled up a holographic display from her wrist device. A star chart materialized between them, showing the local system. 3 blue dots were moving toward the system's edge. Vaughn's cruisers. Surrounding the system, in concentric rings that made Verk's stomach drop, were hundreds of green dots. "Those are all yours," he said. "Those are the ones we are allowing your sensors to see," she corrected. "When your cruisers arrive, we will open a communication channel. You will be on that channel. You will tell Adjudicator Vaughn what you have seen here. The vault, the preservation effort, the 60,000 years of custodianship, and you will tell him that Earth is offering to return it." Verk stared at her. "Return it?" "All of it. Every artifact, every record, every name. Cataloged, preserved, documented with full provenance records for every piece. We will give it all back. We built that vault as a trust, archaeologist, not a trophy case. We always intended to return it when your people came back." "Then why the weapons? Why the fleet? Why the charges at my dig site?" Ren's expression shifted. There it was again, that complicated emotion that looked like anger from a distance, but up close was something older and sadder, and infinitely more tired. "Because your people cut through the seal," she said. "Because you did not knock. Because after 60,000 years of waiting, the first thing your civilization did when it came back was break a hole in the wall and start taking things without asking. Because the retrieval protocol in your own files, the one that said someone might come back in 10,000 years, made no provision for requesting access, only for taking." She let that settle. "We are a patient species, archaeologist. We waited 60,000 years for this meeting. We are prepared to negotiate, to cooperate, to hand over every artifact with a full accounting and our gratitude for the privilege of having kept them. But we will not be looted. Not again. Not by anyone. Not even by the people whose heritage it is." The hours before Vaughn's arrival were the longest of Verk's life. Ren assigned him a liaison, a young cultural officer named Davin Akari, who spoke fluent Kayarthani with an accent that Verk could not place until Davin explained, with visible pride, that he had learned the language from the original Kayarthani recordings stored in the vault. 60,000-year-old language tapes. The humans had not only preserved the recordings, they had used them to train their own people in Kayarthani language, history, and cultural protocol. Davin knew more about Kayarthani social customs than most Kayarthani university students. Davin walked Verk through the defense installations ringing the dig site, not as a prisoner being shown the walls of his cell, but as a guest being given context. The installations were impressive not because of their firepower, though their firepower was considerable, but because of their integration. Every weapon system, every sensor array, every communication tower was connected to every other element in a network that covered the entire planet and extended into orbital space and beyond. Earth did not have a military. Earth was a military, functioning as a single organism with the landmass as its body and the orbital fleet as its extended reach. "How long has this been operational?" Verk asked, standing beside a gun emplacement that could track targets in low orbit with a precision that made his eyes water. "In its current form, about 12,000 years, Davin said, but the planning started much earlier. The first defensive assessments were conducted roughly 35,000 years ago, when the population reached a consensus that any species capable of interstellar travel would eventually return to previously visited worlds. We built the defense network to ensure that, when that day came, we would be able to choose the terms of the conversation. 35,000 years of defensive planning. 35,000 years of preparation, Davin corrected gently. We do not plan for war, archaeologist. We prepare for the moment when we must explain ourselves to the people who left us behind. The weapons exist because explanation without the ability to enforce boundaries is just pleading. We decided a long time ago that we would not plead. The phrase hit Verk with physical force. Explain themselves. As though humanity owed an explanation to anyone. As though a species that had been abandoned on a minor planet by a civilization that considered them primitive had any obligation to account for what they had become in the intervening millennia. And yet they had prepared for it. 35,000 years of building and waiting and preserving, all oriented toward a single anticipated moment. The day when the Kairthani or someone like them came back, and the humans had to be ready to say, "Look what we kept for you." Verk thought about the academic conferences he had attended, where scholars debated the ethical obligations of archaeological retrieval, the proper protocols for handling another culture's heritage, the reverence owed to artifacts of civilizations that could no longer speak for themselves. The humans had been speaking the entire time. The Kairthani just had not been listening. Adjudicator Torsh Vaughn's cruisers dropped out of transit drive at the edge of the system at 8:47 local time. Verk was on the bridge of Wren's command vessel, a sleek warship called the Meridian Vigil that was parked in low orbit above the dig site. Wren stood at the command console, her posture relaxed, her eyes sharp. Davin stood 2 steps behind Verk, quiet, attentive, his presence a reminder that the humans had anticipated this moment with enough specificity to have a Kairthani-speaking cultural officer standing ready. The display showed Vaughn's 3 cruisers, each one a respectable fighting vessel by Kairthani standards, bristling with particle arrays and ablative plating, materializing at the system's perimeter. Verk watched the Dominion ships settle into formation, their transponders broadcasting authority codes and demand for compliance signals on every open frequency. Then the display updated, the human fleet decloaked. Not all of it. Wren had told him they would reveal only enough to make the situation clear, but enough turned out to be 64 warships, arranged in a hemisphere around the system's inner zone, their weapons arrays visible and powered but not locked. Behind them, the orbital defense platforms pulsed with standby energy, and at the system's edge, the deep space monitoring stations broadcast active scanning beams that washed over Vaughn's cruisers like searchlights. The smallest human warship in the display was 4 times the tonnage of Vaughn's flagship. The largest was the one Verk had seen from the surface, the mountain-sized vessel that extended past the horizon. Verk watched the telemetry and saw the exact moment Vaughn's sensor operators understood what they were looking at. The Kairthani cruisers stopped moving. Their engines cut to minimum power. Their weapons remained powered down. One of the cruisers began broadcasting a standard neutral approach signal, overriding the demand for compliance codes. Vaughn was many things, but he was not stupid. "Open the channel," Wren said. The display split. On one side, the tactical overview. On the other, the interior of Vaughn's flagship bridge. The adjudicator himself was standing at the center of the frame, a tall, silver-scaled Kairthani in formal judicial robes, his crest spines flattened against his skull in what Verk recognized as involuntary stress response. Behind him, bridge officers worked their stations with the controlled movements of people who were very deliberately not looking at the tactical display. "This is Adjudicator Torsh Vaughn of the Kairthani Scholarly Dominion," Vaughn said. His voice was steady, which was impressive given the circumstances. "I am responding to a distress signal from the archaeological vessel Quiet Record. I demand to speak with the ranking officer of whatever force has detained my citizens." Wren stepped forward. Commander Odessa Wren, Northern Rampart Sector, Earth Defense Authority. Welcome to our system, Adjudicator. We have been expecting you. You are holding my citizens. I am hosting your citizens. None of them are harmed. Your senior archaeologist is standing beside me. Wren glanced at Verk and gestured him forward. Verk stepped into the frame. Vaughn's eyes locked on him, scanning for injury, for coercion, for signs that his words were not his own. Verk straightened his posture and spoke the truth. Adjudicator, I am unharmed. My team is unharmed, with one exception. Researcher Pelling was killed in the initial incident, but not by the humans. The charge that killed her was triggered by our own excavation equipment destabilizing in a structural collapse caused by our breach of the vault seal. The humans provided medical assistance to the injured and have treated us with courtesy and professionalism throughout. Vaughn's eyes narrowed, and the distress signal. Automated. I would have countermanded it if I could have reached the ship's systems in time. Adjudicator, I need you to listen to me very carefully, because the situation here is not what any of us expected. Verk told him, all of it. The vault, the preservation effort, the 60,000 years of custodianship, the homeworld spectrum lighting, the climate controls calibrated to Kyrthani atmospheric parameters, the musical instruments built to reproduce Kyrthani frequencies, the names on the wall, the cures that had saved millions, the art and instruments and personal effects of people who had lived and died on this world before the Dominion decided it was not worth keeping. He spoke for 11 minutes without interruption, and when he finished, the silence on Vaughn's bridge was absolute. Vaughn was quiet for 23 seconds. Verk counted them. They wish to return the artifacts, Vaughn said at last. His voice had changed. The judicial authority was still there, but beneath it was something else, something that sounded like the expression on a man's face when the floor beneath him shifts. All of them, every piece, documented and preserved with full provenance records. They built the vault as a trust, adjudicator. They were waiting for us to come back. Vaughn looked at Wren. Wren looked back at him with the steady, patient expression of a woman who had been trained for this meeting, the way soldiers are trained for combat, through preparation, discipline, and the absolute conviction that the outcome mattered. Commander, Vaughn said, I apologize for the manner of our arrival. Wren inclined her head. We understand the protocols of concern, adjudicator. Your people sent a distress signal. You responded. That is not an act that requires apology. Nevertheless, I apologize, and I request permission to bring my delegation to the surface to begin formal discussions regarding the transfer. Granted, docket coordinates we are transmitting now. Leave your weapons powered down. You will be met by a diplomatic escort. Vaughn hesitated. Then, for the first time in the conversation, his voice lost its judicial formality and became something smaller and rower. Commander Wren, you said you have been expecting us. Yes. For how long? Wren's mouth curved, not quite a smile. More like the expression of someone who has waited a very long time to deliver a message, and wants to get it exactly right. Adjudicator Vaughn, she said. We have been ready for this conversation for 35,000 years. We are glad you are finally here. The negotiations took 11 days. Verk sat in on every session, not as a participant but as a witness. He watched with the attention of a man who was beginning to understand that this was the most important excavation of his career, not of objects, but of meaning. The discussions were held in a surface facility. The humans had constructed specifically for this purpose, not improvised. Verk realized with a familiar chill, but designed and maintained for decades in anticipation of exactly this kind of meeting. The chairs were built to Kyrthani ergonomic specifications. The lighting matched the homeworld spectrum. The atmospheric controls were tuned to Kyrthani comfort parameters. The water provided at the table had been treated to match the mineral content of the Kyrthani homeworld's primary freshwater source. The humans had built a diplomatic suite for a species they had never met, based on 60,000-year-old laboratory samples and equipment calibrations, and the specifications were correct to within measurable tolerances. Vaughn noticed. He sat in a chair that fit his body perfectly, breathed air that smelled like home, drank water that tasted like the river behind his childhood estate, and said nothing about it. But Verk saw the adjudicator's crest spines flatten and rise and flatten again throughout the first 3 sessions, and he saw the moment on the 4th day, when Vaughn stopped treating the negotiations as a jurisdictional exercise and started treating them as something closer to a reckoning. The terms were complex in their logistics but simple in their essence. Earth would transfer the entire contents of the vault to the Kayarthani scholarly dominion. Every artifact, every record, every preserved sample. The transfer would be conducted under joint supervision, with human archivists working alongside Kayarthani specialists to ensure proper handling and documentation. In exchange, the Dominion would formally acknowledge Earth's custodianship and establish a permanent cultural exchange mission on Earth's surface. Wren insisted on one additional clause, and she delivered it with the flat precision of someone who had rehearsed the words for years. The Kayarthani would never again classify a species as primitive without first examining what that species had built during the time it was not being watched. Vaughn agreed without argument. Verk suspected that Vaughn would have agreed to considerably more. On the final day, after the formal agreement was signed and sealed and transmitted to the Dominion's central archive, Verk walked alone to the vault one last time. He entered through the front door, the massive stone gateway that the humans had hidden beneath the desert floor, and descended through the tiers in the warm, false daylight that smelled like home. He stood in the lowest tier for an hour, reading names. Then he climbed back to the surface and found Wren standing on the ridge overlooking the dig site, watching the first transfer containers being loaded onto Kayarthani transport shuttles. The containers were human-manufactured, built to Kayarthani specifications, lined with environmental controls calibrated to homeworld conditions, each one tagged with a detailed inventory in both languages and a handling protocol that was more rigorous than anything Verk's own museum used. The vast warship still hung in the upper atmosphere. The defense installation still ringed the dig site. Earth had not powered down a single weapon, but the weapons were no longer pointed at the Kayarthani ships. They were simply there, present, visible, undeniable. The way a mountain range is present, the way an ocean is present, not a threat, a fact. "Archaeologist," Wren said, standing beside him in the bright desert morning as the shuttles lifted on columns of controlled thrust. "There is something I should tell you before you leave." "Yes." "The vault is not the only one." Verk turned to look at her. The sunlight caught the scar on her face, and for a moment she looked exactly like the sandstone ridges around them, weathered, patient, ancient in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with endurance. "There are 17 vaults on this planet," she said. "Your people were not the only ones who visited Earth and left things behind. 6 other species came, studied us, judged us insufficient, and departed. Each one left artifacts, heritage, names, and we kept all of it." Verk opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Every species," he said. "Every species that came here and left something behind. Every culture that looked at us and saw nothing worth staying for. We kept their heritage because they would not. We preserved their art, their science, their music, their names, their personal belongings, their research, their cures, their failures, their love letters and their grocery lists, and the toys their children left on the floor. We kept everything. Because someone should." She looked at the sky, at the warships, the clouds, the endless pale blue that stretched from horizon to horizon, at the defense platforms in orbit, visible as faint silver crescents against the atmosphere, at the planetary shield generators humming on the ridgeline. "We are not a military power, archaeologist. We are not an empire. We are not conquerors or warriors or enforcers. We are custodians. We built all of this because custodianship without the strength to protect it is just a collection waiting to be stolen. And we will guard what we have kept until the day the people who left it come back to claim it. And then we will give it back, and we will remember their names, and we will ask only one thing in return. What? That they remember we were here. That when they teach their children about this world, they do not call it primitive. That they say, instead, there was a planet where a young species found what we had discarded, and they thought it was worth 60,000 years of their lives to keep it safe. Verk stood in the desert of a world his people had abandoned 60,000 years ago, and he looked at the woman who had spent her career guarding his heritage. And he understood with perfect clarity why humanity had built warships the size of small moons and defense platforms that could stop a fleet and gun emplacements that could track targets in orbit. Not because they feared invasion. Because they had something worth protecting, and they had decided 60,000 years ago that no one would ever take it from them. Not through force, not through indifference, not through the slow erosion of time. They would keep it all. They would maintain it all. They would remember it all. And when the people who had left those things behind finally came back, the humans would hand it over with the quiet dignity of custodians who had fulfilled a trust that no one had asked them to accept. I will remember, Verk said. His voice was rough and unsteady, and he did not care. My people will remember. I will make certain of it. Ren nodded. Just once. The way a custodian nods when the rightful owner finally returns and says the words that make the long years of keeping worth the cost. The transport shuttles lifted from the desert floor, carrying 60,000 years of Kyrthani heritage back to a civilization that had forgotten it existed. Verk watched them rise through the bright morning air, each container a fragment of a debt so vast it could not be repaid with treaties or trade agreements or diplomatic missions. It could only be repaid with memory. He boarded his own ship last. At the top of the ramp, he paused and looked back across the desert basin one final time. The dig site was already being cleaned and restored by human preservation teams. The breach in the vault seal was being repaired. The defense installations hummed on the ridgelines, patient and watchful. And on the ridge where they had stood together, Commander Odessa Wren remained a single figure against the stone, her hands at her sides, watching him leave the way she had watched everything, with the steady, unsentimental attention of someone who would be here tomorrow, and the day after, and the millennium after that, keeping what needed to be kept and waiting for whoever came next. Verk descended through the atmosphere of a world that had been dismissed as insignificant by every species that had ever visited it. Below him, the desert basin shrank, and the defense installations became small geometric patterns against the stone, and the cities he had first seen from orbit blazed with light across the continents, and the warships hung in the upper atmosphere like patient sentinels guarding not a fortress but a library. 16 vaults remained. 16 other civilizations' discarded heritage, preserved in perfect conditions, waiting for owners who might never return. And the humans would keep waiting. They would maintain the vaults, update the catalogs, replace the environmental systems, train new generations of archivists in languages no one else spoke, and hold the door open for 60,000 years more if they had to. Because that was what custodians did. They kept things safe until the people who needed them came home. Verk Solen pressed his hand flat against the viewport of his departing ship, 6 fingers spread wide, and held it there until the planet was a blue-white sphere against the dark. Then he went to his cabin and began writing his report to the scholarly Dominion. The first line took him 3 attempts because his hands would not stop trembling. He settled, finally, on the simplest truth he knew. We abandoned them. They kept us alive. It is time we earned the grace they gave us.